This might come as a surprise, especially to those of you who are familiar with my work, but most of my photography is done with a high-resolution camera. It has for a few years now. You might be wondering why, since I like to destroy my images in post by crashing the shadows or adding a lot of grain. No, it's not about sharpness or image quality at all, but there are at least 6 ways in which having more megapixels makes my life as a photographer much easier. First, let me give you some context. It all started back in 2020 during the pandemic, of course, when I decided to move back to full frame from the aps-c camera I was using at the moment. I wasn't necessarily looking for a high-resolution camera, I just wanted a bigger full frame sensor. And so it happened that the cheapest model I could find at the time was the Sony A7Rii II and its glorious 42 megapixel sensor. I was familiar with the system and I already had lenses and batteries and other accessories that I could use with that camera, so it was the obvious move for me. And at first, I have to say that all of those extra megapixels felt a little bit overwhelming and overkill. But what do you know, they grew on me over the years. So much so that when it came time to upgrade my camera, I went for another model of the A7R series, in this case the A7R4 with a whopping 61 megapixel sensor. All these pixels come with some downsides, of course, I'll talk about them later, but I love it because they enable me to do things that I couldn't do before, or they were much harder. Being able to crop is the first obvious one. It was like having a superpower. All of a sudden, all of my lenses had extra reach for free. I can easily get 50% more reach and still have plenty of data to play with. That means that a lens like the one I use the most, the Tamron 28-200mm super zoom, all of a sudden became a 28-300mm lens. Or that a prime lens like this 35 could double as a 50 and anywhere in between, and even beyond that, you can crop farther than those 50mm when you have 61 megapixels. The second benefit I get from using a high-resolution camera is more of a personal issue because of the artistic decision I made a few years ago of shooting or making my images square. Now, I don't know of any digital camera with a square sensor, at least not one that I can afford. So every time I take a photo, I have to crop it to that square aspect ratio. I'm wasting a lot of the frame. For this very specific camera with a 3x2 sensor, that means that I'm wasting or discarding 33% of the megapixels that I'm getting. So right away, without any additional cropping, I'm down from 61 to 40 megapixels, which is still plenty, way more than I need, but it's getting lower. If you start with a 24 megapixel sensor and you crop to square, you are down to 16. Still enough, but it's starting to get tight if you need to do some additional cropping. Having pixels to spare changed the way I approach photography in the field in a very interesting way that I did not expect. You see, I love to experiment and play with my images in post, and not just, changing the contrast, the tones and all that kind of stuff, but also changing the framing of the photo. But while you can always crop in a little bit and see what that does to the composition, it's impossible to crop out. That's why when I'm composing a photograph in the field and I have the composition I want, I like to zoom out a little bit or take a step back. Doing this gives me a little bit of wiggle room to play with the framing in post, even if it's just a tiny change. A high megapixel photo might seem overkill today, especially because most of the photography that we consume today is on a screen, on a tiny screen most of the time. But if there is one constant with technology, and that includes photography, is that it's constantly changing. You could make the argument that more megapixels were more useful in the past, when most of the photography consumption was done with prints or books, whereas today, again, we do it through our little tiny devices. That said, it's not hard to imagine a future where that changes again. I'm a little bit skeptical about this, but who knows, perhaps within 5 to 10 years we will all be wearing VR or AR glasses all the time. If that happens, we might want to have the highest resolution possible of our images, because all of a sudden we can make them as big as we want. So yeah, absolutely, 61 megapixels is overkill for Instagram, but they might not be for virtual reality or whatever comes next. That's why they call it future-proof. If you like what you see in this channel, you are going to love our community over on Patreon. Besides supporting my work, thank you very much. There you'll find weekly videos with in-depth analysis of the composition and editing of my photography trips, the contact sheets with all the photos I take, and much more. Follow the link in the description to check it out. Going back to cropping in camera, one of the reasons why I like using a high-resolution camera is because I can use aps-c lenses. I can set this camera to crop mode and still get plenty of resolution to play with. One of those lenses is this one, the Sony A7Rii to 350mm, a lens that I really like, because even though I usually don't have a need for such a long focal length, this is a 525mm equivalent in full frame. This lens is so small, so light and so compact that I don't mind, throwing it in my backpack just in case. I use it every once in a while and I get amazing images when I use it. If I had a full frame telephoto lens with this reach, it'd be much heavier, much bigger and much more expensive. A lens like that would probably stay behind most of the time, whereas I don't mind carrying this one around even though I don't use it that often. Alright, the sixth and last reason or benefit that I get from a high-resolution camera doesn't have to do with photography but with video. I'm a photographer first, but video and especially YouTube does play a big role in my career, in my job. My video camera of choice is the one that I'm using to record this video. Is a Sony A7 IV with a 33 megapixel sensor. That resolution means that I can also use it to take photographs, and I often do because I have an ultra-wide angle lens there to record myself most of the time. It's a 16-28 and it complements perfectly this 28-200, so when I carry those two cameras and those two lenses, I'm covered from anything between 16 and 200 or 300 if you use crop mode in this camera, which is amazing, and it gives me a lot of flexibility and versatility when I'm shooting in bad conditions, which is most of the time because I don't have to be switching lenses. I'm always ready to capture anything that I encounter with these two cameras. About video though, I know that Sony has better cameras for video like the A7S line or the CVE1, I believe is the name. Anyway, those cameras have a 12 megapixel sensor, which is much better in low light, and it also has a much faster readout. But those are things that I personally don't need. I rarely shoot in the dark, and when I do, I don't mind if it's a little bit grainy. I mostly record myself, not fast moving subjects, and usually from a tripod, so again, it's okay if the sensor is slow, but the downsides of a lower resolution sensor are more important to me. The first one is that it'd be very hard to take photographs with a 12 megapixel camera because, again, I have to crop it square. That's my artistic decision, so from 12 I'm already down to 9 megapixels. Also, the A7S doesn't support 4K in aps-c mode because those 12 megapixels are not enough to give you a 4K resolution when cropping 50%. That is something that the A7 IV can do with no problem. That means, of course, two things. The first one is that I can use aps-c lenses like this size 16-70, which I love. It is so small. I use it for video very often. And the second thing is that I can set my camera to aps-c mode even when using my full frame 16-28mm lens, meaning that it becomes effectively a 16-42 millimeter lens, and still get very good quality 4K video, and that pretty much covers all I need in just one lens. Of course, this is not to say that the A7 IV is a better camera than the A7S for video, for anything. It just comes down to your use case and to your needs, and for my needs, for my use case, for what I use my cameras for, the A7 IV makes more sense. The high resolution sensor in this camera doesn't mean that my images are better just because of that, not at all. In fact, many of my favorite images were made with a 20 megapixel compact camera or even my phone. It also comes with downsides, of course, because the bigger files are going to require bigger SD cards, bigger hard drives, and more powerful computers to edit those files in post. So please be aware that all I said in this video is just my very specific way to do photography and video. Take what you find useful and discard what doesn't apply to you. Anyway, let me know what you think about high resolution cameras, if you use one, why or why not. But for now, I hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.